Apple just made more profit in a single quarter than most entire countries collect in annual government revenue. Long-term investors keep treating Apple stock less like a tech company and more like a cash-generating machine that happens to sell phones. Here's whether that reputation actually holds up under the numbers. The numbers that started this conversation. In its most recent quarter, Apple reported revenue of $111.18 billion, up 16.6% year over year, with net income climbing to $29.58 billion. iPhone revenue alone jumped from $46.84 billion to $56.99 billion in a single year, driven by what management called extraordinary demand for the latest iPhone lineup. That was Apple's 8th consecutive quarter beating Wall Street's earnings estimates, 8 in a row. In an industry where missing expectations by even a few percentage points can wipe out billions in market value overnight, Apple has built a track record of simply not missing, quarter after quarter, year after year. The part most people miss: services. Everyone understands Apple sells iPhones. What most casual investors underestimate is what's happening underneath the hardware. Apple's services segment, the App Store, iCloud, Apple Music, Apple Pay, and everything else running on top of the devices you already own, pulled in $30.98 billion last quarter, up from $26.64 billion the year before. Services now represents roughly a quarter of Apple's total revenue. Here's why that number matters more than it looks. Services carries a gross margin of roughly 75% compared to under 50% on hardware. That means services, despite being a smaller slice of revenue, contributes around 41% of Apple's total gross profit. Apple has quietly built a recurring, high-margin software business with over 2.5 billion active devices feeding into it. Every iPhone sold isn't just a one-time sale anymore. It's a new subscriber added to an ecosystem that keeps generating revenue for years afterward. The cash machine. Here's where it gets genuinely remarkable. Since Apple began returning capital to shareholders in 2012, the company has paid out over $1 trillion, with roughly $850 billion of that coming through stock buybacks alone. In April 2026, Apple's board authorized another $100 billion buyback program, its 7th consecutive year authorizing a program at that scale, alongside a 4% dividend increase. Think about that for a moment. Most companies dream of generating $100 billion in total revenue. Apple authorizes that amount just to buy back its own stock in a single announcement as a routine part of doing business. And while Microsoft, Google, and Amazon are pouring upwards of $180 to $200 billion each into AI infrastructure this year, Apple's entire capital expenditure budget sits at roughly $13 billion. Apple isn't racing to outspend its competitors on data centers. It's choosing to hand that cash directly back to the people who own the stock. Why long-term holders love this combination. Buybacks shrink the number of shares outstanding. Fewer shares outstanding means each remaining share owns a larger slice of the same profit. Apple's earnings per share grew 22% last quarter on revenue growth of only 17%. The gap between those two numbers is the buyback machine quietly working in the background, compounding returns for anyone holding the stock and doing absolutely nothing else. Combine that with a brand that generates some of the highest customer loyalty and repeat purchase rates of any consumer products company on earth. A balance sheet sitting on well over $100 billion in cash, and a market capitalization of $3.8 trillion that makes Apple roughly 6% of the entire S&P 500 index. And you start to understand why so many long-term investors describe Apple less as a stock pick and more as a core holding you simply don't sell. The honest counterpoint. No stock is risk-free, and buy and hold forever is a strategy, not a guarantee. Apple's growth is increasingly dependent on a single product line. iPhone still drives over half of total revenue. And the company faces real questions about chip supply diversification away from its current manufacturing partners, rising component costs, and whether it can credibly compete in the AI infrastructure race its biggest rivals are spending hundreds of billions to win. Past performance, including 8 consecutive earnings beats and a decade of buybacks, does not guarantee future results. This video is for informational purposes only and isn't personalized financial advice. Talk to a financial advisor before making any investment decision. But for investors looking for a business that prints cash, rewards shareholders relentlessly, and has done it consistently for over a decade, it's easy to see why Apple keeps earning a permanent seat near the top of so many long-term portfolios.